This is our this is our video lecture over political parties. So in this chapter, we're just going to talk about what the purpose of political parties are, how that developed in the United States. Take a look at why third parties have such a difficult time, finding ground in the United States, and just kind of what parties do for us as citizens. So, first, we'll just define what the political party is: a group that shares political principles and is organized to win elections to control government. So, the most important function of a political party is to run candidates for office. If they don't run candidates for office, then none of the other things they do are really necessary. They'll raise money, they'll help strategize, they'll help coordinate campaigns, but if there are no candidates running for office, then they don't really have anything to invest all of that effort into. Uh, Here in the United States, looking at the way Americans identify. So, as of 2018, we had 27% of Americans identifying as Democrat, 26% identifying as Republican, and 44% who identify as independent. And we tend to think of those independent people as our moderates. They're not really committed to one side or the other fully. They like to hear good ideas. They can be swayed by a good campaign, a charismatic candidate. That's who our candidates are aiming for when they campaign. Those 27 and 26% of people, they're already committed to their party and their ideology. It's those swing voters, those moderates, who are going to decide our election every year. If we compare that to 2005, in 2005, we had 34% of Americans identifying as Democrat, 33% identifying as Republican, and 30% identifying as independent. So we can definitely see that there's been a rise in moderates. And when we look at a lot of the party and ideological demographics for millennials, that follows that trend. Millennials are more and more identifying as moderates. They may have a lean one way or the other, but they are looking for candidates with good ideas. Now, if we look at the favorability and unfavorable rating of the two main parties, we can see that those have changed quite a bit. If we look at August 2016, the favorable rating of the Republican Party was 36% versus 58% unfavorable rating. This is before President Trump is elected president. We're still waiting for numbers and statistics and demographic information. It's always a few years behind. So it'd be interesting to see how President Trump has affected those numbers. If we look at the Republican Party in July of 2005, this would be, this would be still during President Bush's, administration. So Republicans had a favorable rating of 46% and unfavorable 45%. So there's definitely more of a favorable view of the Republicans then, and of course this was just a few years after 9/11, a few years after we had gone to war. So that probably contributes to that favorability rating. People were still a little more united then, not quite as polarized as we've become today. Looking at the Democratic Party, August 2016. Democratic Party had a favorable rating of 44%. I'm sorry, 44 versus 46 unfavorable. Now, if we look at the election in 2016, that's actually not surprising because more Americans did vote for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. She won the popular vote by 3 million votes. And so it kind of backs up this idea that there is a higher favorability rating for the Democrats at this time. Unfortunately, the Electoral College kind of threw a monkey wrench in that system, and the least favorable candidate was actually able to win by winning the correct amount of states in the Electoral College. Looking at 2005. Democrats had a favorable rating of 52 versus 38 unfavorable. Um, this one is hard for me to explain, honestly. Maybe there was a strong contingent of people who were opposed to going to war in Iraq. A lot of Americans approved of us taking action in Afghanistan because that's where we believed Osama bin Laden was. But once we went into Iraq, there were a lot of people, who were not supportive of that decision. And so that could contribute to this high favorability of the Democratic Party. And then in three years, we would elect President Obama, who would have one of the highest favorability ratings as president. So, this is not that surprising, but it is kind of hard to explain it being so close to 9/11 and the beginning of the war as well. So, what do parties do? Parties help people kind of find their own personal ideology. So, the main two parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, we tend to know their ideology. There is, Democrats tend to be more associated with the ideology of being liberal. Republicans tend to be more conservative and support issues accordingly. Where people kind of, some people believe that we need more parties in this country because, those two teams don't necessarily represent all of the views that are out there. This graphic here on the right shows some of the third parties that exist in the country. Not all of them have a big profile or get a lot of attention. The Green Party is somewhat known but not popular. They usually only run candidates in presidential elections. They don't have much success at the state or local level. The Marijuana Party, I'll let you guess what their issue is. They could have been the Green Party as well. The name would have been fitting. Uh, the Modern Whig Party, the Pirate Party. These are people who don't believe in copyright law and believe that everything a thing on the internet should be fair game. The Independent American Party. This one kind of perplexes me because if you're independent, how do you form an idea around being independent? Because being independent means that you don't really share any ideology. Libertarians are probably the most well known of the third parties. These are people who, they believe that government should be involved in our lives as little as possible. They tend to be more open minded on social issues like drug use, gay rights, abortion, things like that. But when it comes to taxation and the rights in the Constitution, they're very conservative. And so, really, the only form of government they really support is like the education system, the public education system, and they're skeptical about the rest. America First kind of has a connotation with racism. America First is an idea it's kind of become intertwined with white nationalism, and so America First is one of those things that makes people a little uncomfortable. Constitution Party, strict adherence to the Constitution, and then, of course, the Socialist and Communist parties of the United States. The Socialist Party actually does have some success in more liberal states like Washington and California and places like that. These tend to be more like your Bernie Sanders, the democratic socialist, advocating for public health care, more public management of resources and things like that. The Communist Party of America does not have a lot of support. The difference between socialism and communism is very it's a vast difference, and it's a lot more than we'll go into in this class. But socialism, we have socialism in this country. We have public education, we have taxpayer-funded roads, and we have Medicare and Medicaid and all that kind of stuff. So socialism does exist in the United States, even though some people don't like that idea. But these are some of the third parties that are out there. And many of them do have some success at the local level, not so much at the federal level, your libertarians, your socialist party. But third parties have had a very difficult time breaking into national politics. Going back to our list, what do parties do? Number two, select candidates. The parties identify people who, could represent the ideology of the party, who have a likelihood of connecting with voters and getting them kind of bringing them to the party and bringing them to the issues that matter to them. The best candidates are ones that are charismatic, very personable people. You think of people like Barack Obama, you think of George W. Bush, think of John F. Kennedy. These are people who, they're very warm people. People kind of gravitate towards them, like their personalities. You don't think of that when you think of President Trump. There are some presidents who are kind of off-putting or wooden and stiff, and politicians at all levels, really. But the ones who are more open and charismatic and personable tend to do the best. Three, mobilize voters. We're in an election year, and most of you have seen, while we were still on campus, all the voter drives, get out the vote, educating people about the elections. And a lot of that stuff is sponsored by the political parties because they want to get people out to vote. The more people that vote and are, educated about the issues, the more likely they are to support one of the two major parties. Four, organized governing activity. So once parties control elected positions, they have a platform, they have ideas that they adhere to, and there's a Republican National Convention and a Democratic National Convention that try and keep party members kind of on the same page when it comes to the issues they're going to support and the things that they're going to advocate for. And then five, integrate new groups into the political process. Every year we have millions and millions of people turning 18 who will vote for the first time. Many of y'all, this is your first time to vote this year. And so, the parties target young voters. They want to connect with people while they're still forming their own political beliefs and get them involved, get them connected with other people. And, the more people participate, the more they tend to feel connected. And so if you can get people kind of enrolled into the parties early, they tend to kind of stay there as long as the party doesn't kind of go into left field and just go completely against what they believe in. Now, some people believe that the party system is detrimental to our democratic system. And a lot of people believe that we should have nonpartisan elections. That this would be when you go vote, when you look at the ballot, there's no indicator of what party somebody belongs to. Instead, you would have to be educated about who those people are, and party affiliation would be less important when people are deciding who they're going to vote for. And we actually do elect city councilors this way and some local positions this way. But a lot of people would like to see this at the federal level, at the highest levels where that party indicator is taken away. Obviously, the Democrats and the Republicans are against this idea. Political socialization, we talked about, how you acquire your political beliefs, what influences you, so we won't go into that. Now, one of the biggest complaints that you hear from a lot of people today is America still being a two-party system. Many countries in the world have multiple parties. If you look at England, I think they have like 8 to 10 parties. If you look at, most European countries, they have upwards of 10 parties. I think India has like 80 something political parties. America is the United States is one of the few that still has this two-party system. And so it essentially forces you to kind of pick a team and find the team that they may not agree with all of your beliefs, but if they agree with enough of your beliefs, that's the team you're gonna fight for. One of the things about political parties that most people don't know is they were never intended to be part of our political system. They're not mentioned in the Constitution. The founding fathers split into parties over the idea of how much power the federal government should hold. And so our two first parties are the Federalists, who believed in a powerful federal government, and the Anti-Federalists, who wanted most of the power in the states. So that's our two, that's the first idea that parties form around. But even George Washington, when George Washington, I think I've mentioned this in class a little bit, but George Washington, when he gives his farewell address, he actually cautions Americans from splitting into factions, which is kind of what the word they used back then. He felt that factions would take people's attention away from what truly mattered, which was doing what was best for the country as a whole. And he's pretty correct. James Madison talked about this as well. But a lot of their predictions about this have come true. You look at how polarized our country is today, and we've pretty much proven Washington and Madison correct in this regard. Um, Third parties, like I said, no third party candidate has ever won the presidency. We currently have no third party candidates, or I'm sorry, no third party members in the U.S. Congress. We have a couple of independents, but most of them started as either a Republican or a Democrat. The closest anyone has come to winning the presidency as a third party candidate was Theodore Roosevelt, running as a Progressive Party candidate. He got 27% of the vote, but only 88 electoral college votes. What third parties tend to do more than anything else is divide the vote, that it can pull enough votes away from a candidate that the other party is able to win. This is what people believed happened to George Bush Sr. A gentleman named Ross Perot ran and pulled votes away from George Bush and ensured that Bill Clinton would win that election. A lot of people blame the Green Party for this in 2000. That if the Green Party hadn't pulled votes away from the Democratic Party, we wouldn't have had the problem with the Electoral College and George Bush winning George Bush Jr. winning the presidency in 2000. So oftentimes third parties can disrupt an election more than anything else. Third parties, like I said, do have some success at the local level. There's about 169 libertarians at the local level, 143 Green Party candidates, won positions in 2018. Like I said, the Socialist Party of America has some people in more liberal states. But overall, the system is still controlled by the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, looking at how this system has evolved in our country. So, like I said, the first issue that really leads to parties or picking sides starts at the founding in 1789 when the Constitution is being written. We have our Federalists versus our Anti-Federalists arguing over how much power federal government should have. The Anti-Federalist would go on to become the Democratic Republican Party. George Washington was a Federalist. He believed that, the whole reason for writing the Constitution was because the federal government was not strong enough. So he was a Federalist, believed that the central government should have more control, and was president for 2 terms and then steps down voluntarily after that second term. The next president would be John Adams, who was also a Federalist. And then in Thomas Jefferson would defeat Adams, and he would be the first anti-federalist or Democratic Republican. And they would go on to win the next 6 presidential elections. And a lot of the issue shifts away from government power to the issue of slavery, and this will lead us into, kind of dominate the political conversation for much of the 1800s. Like I said, Washington was dissatisfied with this party system as it developed. When he was president, he tried to govern in a nonpartisan way. His guiding principle was to always do what was best for the country, for the people. And like he said, this party system led to dirty politics, dirty campaigns, personal attacks, and it started to pull people away from each other. And so rather than coming together to compromise, we start to see, what polarization could do to the country. This animosity between the parties eventually culminates in a duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was the vice president. He was a Democratic Republican, and Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist. They had been hurling insults at each other back and forth, and decided to duel. to settle their issue. And Alexander Hamilton, who was you know, a great mind and one of the founding fathers, is killed in this duel. And so this just shows how ridiculous the party system got at that time. But after 1800, the Federalists, never win another election in the United States. Our second kind of party system change is from 1828 to 1860. And this is kind of led by Andrew Jackson. He wins the presidency in 1828, and he is a Democrat. So the Democratic Republicans they had split into two separate parties, the Democrats and the Whig Party. Jackson is kind of the head and the face of the Democratic Party. And he is so popular that many people come to his inauguration to essentially try and get a job in his administration. And so the party system now is kind of entrenched in American politics by 1828. Didn't take a long time. Democrats were kind of the more populist party. They were favored by farmers, urban industrial workers, favored local control of government. Now, one of the things that they advocated for, and Jackson is known for, is the near genocide of Native Americans. They were also, definitely driven by manifest destiny and westward expansion, and so Jackson did a lot of things to bring access to government to the people that he should be recognized for. But there's that dual side where, Jackson is responsible for the Trail of Tears. And so he's one of those complicated figures in American politics that did a lot of great things for the American people, but a lot of terrible things for people of color. The Trail of Tears for Native Americans, continuing war with Mexico to take more territory. And Jackson essentially believed that the question of slavery should be left up to the states. The Whig Party favored a stronger central government, believed that we should start spending money to build the infrastructure of the United States, favored large businesses and industry, and the Whigs were divided on the issue of slavery. And that is the issue that would lead to the end of the Whig Party and the creation of the Republican Party. So this brings us to the third party system, and this is pretty much the duration of the Civil War. So the Whigs split. Some of them, the issue of slavery, some of them joined the Democratic Party over their stance on slavery of leaving it up to the states. Others form a new party called the Republican Party. And then this party, Lincoln becomes the face of the Republican Party. He is elected president. He is he is an abolitionist, believes that we should do away with slavery in the United States, that all new states admitted to the Union should be free states. And so this leads to the split in our country that would become the Civil War. The Republicans, they had been preparing for the Civil War, had been, stockpiling supplies, training soldiers, for the Union Army. And that gave them an advantage over the Confederacy because the Confederacy kind of forms on the fly and has no infrastructure like that. So we know, the outcome of the Civil War. The North will win the Civil War, and Republicans dominate the electoral process through Reconstruction all the way up to 1874. Lincoln obviously will be assassinated, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, will be impeached but not convicted for not upholding the principles of Reconstruction. But the Democrats take back the House in 1874, and they control almost all the southern states. The Republicans control the Northeast and the Midwest. And then as we move into the late 1800s, immigration starts to change, what the parties focus on. More immigrants are coming into the United States from Europe. from Asia, from Latin America, and and they have to start taking the concerns of these new citizens into account because now these new citizens are Americans and they are voting as well. Democrats control most of the cities, and Republicans are more popular in rural areas, which is still the case today, even though their ideologies are very different. At the end, towards the end of the 1800s, we see the development of what are called party machines, and this is essentially, the process of having these party bosses who essentially pick who are going to be the candidates. It's usually a very senior, wealthy, powerful figure within the party, and this will continue into the early 20th century. But they're going to organize supporters of the party and kind of decide who the candidates are going to be. We will eventually move away from this, but it'll be a little while before that happens. The fourth party system, 1896 to 1832. This is business and reform. So during this era, we start to see some shifting between the Democrats and the Republicans. So Democrats become the populist party, meaning they are the ones who represent the working American, the blue collar, the middle class, the poor. And Republicans, this is where they start to get their reputation as being the party of big business and being the party of millionaires. This is where they start the process of evolving into the parties they are today. There is a large divide in the country leading up to the Great Depression between the working class and the wealthy. And so, at this time, if you're a blue collar American working in a factory, you might be working 16-hour days. There were no worker protections. You might be living in slums because there's no protections. There's no rules about housing and cleanliness and things like that. And the Republicans advocate for keeping the status quo because most of their supporters are wealthy individuals who own these slums, who own these factories. And the Democrats start to focus on equality in politics and in the economy for all Americans. And this is where the Roosevelts start to come to prominence. Theodore Roosevelt, leads the new Progressive Party's, push to regulate business. At this time, there's a lot of monopoly and price fixing and things like that happening in our country, and Teddy Roosevelt wants to regulate this, to break up monopolies, to protect workers, advocates for allowing women to vote, and electing senators directly instead of allowing state legislatures to do so, because state legislatures are pretty much like today controlled by wealthy individuals. And then, of course, Teddy Roosevelt is responsible for creating a lot of the worker protections that we have in place today. Things like, this is where we see the limiting of the workday. At first, it's 10 hours, and then it'll be decreased to 8 hours. Workplace safety regulations, ending child labor, that kind of stuff. We also go through prohibition during this era, and this is one of the things that a lot of women are advocating for because they believe that alcohol and drunkenness is kind of responsible for some of the ills of the country, and they believe if we can prohibit alcohol, then things will improve. But that it actually backfired and created the black market. This is where we get the beginnings of organized crime and bootleggers and all those things that we associate with the 1920s and stuff like that. But there's also this kind of undercurrent of racism to the idea of prohibition, because a lot of these things are corruption and uncleanliness and deterioration of the family. It's also being blamed on immigrants because more immigrants are coming into the country at this time, and not just people of color. This is still Irish people, Italians, and even some people from Europe are being accused of this as well. So this is a period a lot of transition happening in our country at this time. Now, the next system, the fifth party system, is defined by the Great Depression. So, the Great Depression starts in 1929. The Roaring Twenties were the Roaring Twenties because of this boom in business, and the wealthy were doing well, and there was all this money and you know partying and all this stuff going on. But it comes to a crash in 1929, and the country doesn't fully recover from the Great Depression until 1941. But of course, we've talked a bit this semester about FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and the New Deal, and how he expanded the size of federal government, expanded the power of government, and implemented a lot of economic programs and reforms and things that didn't exist before, to use the strength of the federal government to pull the country out of the Depression. Um, the New Deal also creates, what we think of as the modern day welfare system, creates Social Security to provide some type of retirement safety net for people, and starts putting Americans back to work by using the the federal government to create work programs in agriculture, to build roads, to build everything that the country needed. And this is when the infrastructure of the United States really starts to begin the process of reaching its peak. Um, Roosevelt, Roosevelt at his core is kind of like Bernie Sanders. He didn't label himself a democratic socialist, but he definitely believed in using the federal government and taxpayer money to improve what he could improve for Americans across the board. And this amount of liberalism, or if you want to call it socialism, you know, drives the remaining conservatives away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and it brings in more progressive individuals who leave the Republican Party and come to the Democrats. And this is where we see African Americans really start to shift their allegiance to the Democratic Party. Previously, most African Americans were Republicans because Lincoln was a Republican, and that's the party that freed the slaves. But this change in how the party views social issues just completely upends the two parties and puts them closer to where they are today. Uh, Democrats had previously controlled the South, but now they're split over this liberalism that FDR brings in with him. And so most of the Southerners that are very conservative leave for the Republican Party, and that changes this Democratic dominance in the South. And then this is where the Republican Party gets its nickname, the GOP, or the Grand Old Party. And our sixth shift, the six party system, this is from kind of the peak of the civil rights movement to today. The Republican Party starts to implement some new strategies now that they have these conservative individuals in the South, siding with the Republican Party. Nixon and Reagan follows this up with kind of making the Republican Party the party of middle class Americans. They want limited government. They want to be business friendly. They want to lower taxes. And of course, who doesn't want to pay lower taxes? And this is where, the average middle class American is, or I would say the average middle class white American starts to associate themselves with the Republican Party. And of course, Reagan was really good at using patriotism and American identity as a way to bring people to the Republican Party. He was a very, very good speaker. I mean, he was an actor, so it makes sense. But he gave these like fiery speeches, and it did make people feel this like intense patriotism for the United States during his era. And Reagan was really good at blaming government for the problems of the country and framing problems in a way of essentially convincing people that government was not a solution to problems, rather, government created problems. And so this is where we start to see the pulling away from the middle ground that the two parties have today that starts that process of polarization we have today. Uh, Democrats take the opposite stance of this. Democrats believe that you can use the power of government to create equality in society. By the 70s and 80s, you know, we've had the civil rights movement, and so communities of color are starting to find their place in American society. And Democrats believe that the government has to play a role in that because things have been unfair and unequal for a very long time. But neither party has full control. The parties go back and forth, back and forth. Um, we have Democrats and Republicans, constantly taking turns with the presidency, essentially. And one party will gain control of Congress and then lose it to in the next election. So we've kind of entered the system of Americans like trying one party for 4, 8 years and then not being satisfied. So they're like, okay, well, now let's see if the other party can do any better. So we've been going back and forth since probably the beginning of the 1970s. Now, party identification. So this is just how people identify. And this chart over here on the right kind of shows political leanings of certain groups in our country. If you look at this, the top list, it's groups that tilt Republican, so that these groups tend to have more of a lean towards the Republican Party. Mormons, white evangelical Protestants, white Southerners, white men with some college education or less, white citizens in general, and the silent generation, or these would be your people that fought in World War II. This is a survey from 2014. I've tried to find an updated one, and I'd like to find one. Groups that tend to tilt Democrat: African Americans, Asians, the religiously unaffiliated, women with postgraduate educations, the Jewish community, Latinos, and the millennial generation. So we can see where a lot of the Republican strength comes from, white citizens in our country and older Americans, whereas younger people tend to be more idealistic. So there's a slight lean towards Democrats, and then, of course, communities of color. Now, being more attached to a party can have the effect of making people participate more in the political process. So people who are attached to one party or the other tend to vote and work, or participate in the election process, getting people out to vote, getting people registered, that kind of stuff, more than their peers who are not associated. Filtering. This is a bad one. The people who strongly identify with one party or the other tend to filter all information they take in through that lens. And so it tends to make people a little less open to ideas that contradict the ideas that they already have. This is one I'm definitely not fond of. You definitely need to be open to all information out there and kind of coming to your own conclusions, not just filtering it through what the party you agree with tells you, or what the candidate you agree with tells you, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, ideology. We know liberal and conservative is heavily associated with Democrats and Republicans today. And then because of that, a lot of people end up just straight ticket voting for their party. They don't even consider ideas from other sides of the spectrum, and this contributes to polarization as well. And those are the base voters. You hear a lot about Trump's base or things like that. Those are the people who are going to vote for that party no matter what. And there's really not much you can do to change their minds. So who are the base for Republicans? This would be your populist. Trump ran as a populist, or this idea that he was a Washington outsider, he was not a politician, and that he could go in there and clean things up. Religious traditionalists, people who are very Protestant Christians, tend to side more with the Republican Party because of their moral convictions and beliefs. Fiscal conservatives, people who don't want government wasting tax money or spending it on social programs to help the poor and things like that. they tend to side with the Republican Party. They believe government spending should be reeled in, that kind of stuff. Libertarians do have a slight lean more towards the Republican Party than towards the Democratic Party because their belief of small government is also shared by the Republican Party. And then your neoconservatives, this is, conservatives who have kind of wrapped all of these things together. So, like, you hear like pastors today that say the Republican Party is the party of God and stuff like that. Those are your neoconservatives, the ones who have kind of grouped all of this together and kind of preach the message that if any of this fits you, then you are a conservative and God wants you to be a conservative and all that kind of stuff. Um, the base for the Democratic Party are progressive individuals, people who believe in more equality regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, any of that kind of stuff. Civil rights groups and people who advocate for increased civil rights. Labor unions, groups that represent the middle class worker, the blue collar worker, labor unions, things like that. And then centrists, those moderates in the middle, even though they're still kind of open to good ideas, most of them tend to be a little more liberal when it comes to social ideas. And then organizing the party. So how's the party organized? Well, there's the platform. The platform lays out what a party believes in, what issues they believe they should focus on. If you're looking at a Republican platform, it's going to have, religious liberty, anti-abortion, small government, lower taxes. That's kind of their platform. The Democrats, racial equality, social justice. A lot more Democrats are advocating for universal health care, and that kind of stuff. And this is usually revised every 4 years when we have a presidential election, because the platform is really going to be set by those presidential candidates who are running for office. Organizing the party. This is everything from activists, people doing, work for different issues, state and local leaders, professionals like people who run campaigns, fundraisers, campaign strategists, stuff like that. In government, our elected officials define the role of the party in elected government. And then the electorate. This is the most unorganized part of the party because that's us. It's the public. It's the people who are registered to vote, registered members of the party. But it can be hard to gauge which direction they're going to go in a given year because some people can, the moderates, the independents, they can change from year to year. And then even your base and your regular supporters, you can't always count on them to get out and vote if they're not really motivated to. So it's hard to predict how the electorate is going to act. The party caucus, we've talked about the caucus in the legislature, but the members of the House and the Senate, they come together to discuss issues and political strategy. And divided government is what we have right now, where we have the House of Representatives controlled by the Democrats and the Senate controlled by the Republicans. And, we have a Republican president, and this definitely slows the process of government down because you don't have agreement across the board. And so getting things done can become a more contentious process. And then I've got a link to a video here that you should watch as well.